I've been driving 18-wheelers for the better part of 15 years now. And all my time on the highways and byways of this great nation of ours, I've only seen one thing that's ever really scared me. I'm not saying that I'm hardcore or something. I've had plenty of things make me anxious or nervous. And I should do a whole lot of worrying when I'm out there, and the great unknown all of my lonesome. But only one single solitary thing that I can safely say terrified me. That was driving through South Dakota, hauling lumber down Highway 73. And out there is some of the most barren, featureless land you could ever have the misfortune of seeing. Don't get me wrong, I love the state. It's home, and it'll always be my home. But sometimes you just want something to look at while you're driving, you know? Anyway, I'm driving down this particularly empty stretch of 75, a place where you can see for miles and miles in every direction, just all horizons as far as the eye can see. And suddenly, I see something on the side of the road. I couldn't tell exactly what it was until I was maybe a few 100 meters away. But it looks an awful lot like a guy crouching over something that was lying at the roadside. It looked like he was picking something up off the ground and bringing it up to his face. And was only as I passed them that I realized what was going on. The thing that was lying on the ground was a piece of roadkill. I don't know if it was a deer or antelope or whatever you want to call it. In fact, I'm not exactly sure what kind of animal it was. I just know that the hands and face of whoever was leaning over it were covered in blood. They were eating that piece of roadkill. And it doesn't take a genius to figure that out. I just have no idea why. I've had people ask me why I didn't stop to see what the person's deal was. But I always turn the question around in them, and ask if they'd want to stop their truck in the middle of nowhere to talk to someone who was eating dead animal. Apart from the occasional tough guy who lives through their teeth and claims that they have gotten out with a gun to play 20 questions or whatever. The answer is always the same? No. I've had a few fairly reasonable suggestions to explain what I was looking at and some not too reasonable ones to some of the less believable range from Bigfoot to Wolfman to the zombie apocalypse. Some people have seen too many movies, but actually by one of the more legit suggestions. We have a few weirdo survivalists enclaves out here in South Dakota, one of which is the old military base turned survivalists compound in the Black Hills that they call X Point. You have to have a fair amount of scratch stashed away to buy one of those bunkers. But I've heard people really do live there. People that have lost their minds anyways. It could have been someone like that beating the road kill someone with too much money and not enough brains who had decided to train themselves for the end of the world. But I can almost guarantee that by eating raw roadkill like that, the only thing they'd be preparing for is their own grave. I use quite a sophisticated GPS system in my truck, meaning I'm able to track and review my journeys in some pretty amazing detail. So when I had enough bars on my cell phone, I called 911 to let them know that there was some crazy person eating roadkill along 73 and past on the rough location of where I'd spotted them. I didn't do it to be a narc or anything. I mainly did it because whoever it was obviously needed some serious help. That and the obvious danger they pose to any regular people who might be unfortunate enough to bump into them while they're in the mood to eat raw roadkill. I just can't imagine what would possess anyone to do something like that. I mean, how close to insanity or desperation do you have to be to just shovel some dead animal's rock guts in your mouth like that? I later had an uncle tell me about feral humans, like this one girl who escaped her abusive parents in the 70s. And when the authorities found her, she was growling like a dog or something. He thought maybe the guy was like that, just totally feral, and had maybe just adapted to eating raw meat like that. I'll file that one under one of the less believable explanations, and the truth is, I don't really think I want to know what was going through their head. Forgive me for commandeering someone else's story here. But I think it's very relevant to the thread, and although my father wasn't a trucker, this has been closely involved someone who was back in the 70s. My dad was an 18-year-old gas station attendant at a 24-hour gas station. One night Dad was the only one working the late shift when one of the sketchiest customers he'd ever laid eyes on walks into the station. My dad said it was really obvious that the guy was concealing something in his pants, and his first thought, which brings on some major panic, is that the guy has a gun on him. Now, a whole lot of truck drivers used to use his station for two reasons. Number one, it had a pretty roomy parking lot, which they used to take naps and breaks, and in number two, it was the only place for miles around the thicket get a bite to eat. Usually, there could have been up to 10 truckers parked up in the log, but on this particular night, there was only one truck there. Luckily though, the guy just so happened to be in the store with my dad. But since Dad didn't know if he was armed, or what kind of guy he was, he figured he was still pretty vulnerable. The weird guy starts walking up and down the rows in the store, and my dad can tell he's not really looking at anything. Most customers either come in to pay for their gas or went straight to the hot food counter to pick out something to eat. Weird guy looks like he's just biding his time before he pulls out his gun and robs the store. At least that's what's going through my dad's head. The trucker comes up to the counter while this is happening, puts down a bag of chips, and just so happens to look over his shoulder at the sketchy guy. Then this moment of pure understanding occurs. The trucker looks at the sketchy guy and looks at my dad, then back and forth, maybe once or twice more, then asked my dad what was supposed to sound like a totally random question. He says something like "quiet night." I wouldn't feel safe. We're going to a gas station alone. You keep the gun behind the counter there or something. Oh, my dad had was a baton. Even so, they belonged to the station's owner. But the trucker widens his eyes and minds and nodded my dad, who suddenly realizes what he's supposed to say and reply. "Oh, yeah." He says, "I got a 45 right here." Always just norms, like the way the trucker continues to play along and bangs his fist on the counter before kind of shielding the action with his body. "Oh, yeah." He says, "Well, check this out. 357 Magnum. Bought it after I saw that movie Dirty Harry. Not as big a bullet as your 45, but it sure does pack a punch. Some days, I just pray some sob messaged me so I can blow his frickin' head off." But as he says that, the sketchy guy just makes a beeline for the door, gets back into his car, then zooms off down the highway. When the guy had left, the trucker turns back to my dad and says something along the lines of, "You know, that cares about the Rafi, right? I was going to take a nap out back, but I think I'm more in the mood for coffee after that. Oh, and the use of a favor. Call the cops." My dad says he always figured guardian angels would be all cheer about half-naked wing ladies that descend playing harps or whatever. We didn't figure they came in the form of some hairy trucker who smelled like he hadn't showered in 3 days. But as he puts it, every day is a school day. The guy spent the entire rest of his break hanging around the store and making conversation with my dad until the cops showed up and my dad could file a report. The trucker confirmed the story to backing my dad up when he said it looked like the sketchy guy had a gun stuffed in the back of his pants. Then get this, right in the middle of talking to the cops, both of the radios start buzzing and they run out of the gas station, get into the patrol car, and speed off down the highway with their lights and sirens on the truck response. Hope a friend and his gun didn't find the trouble they were looking for. Only they had. My dad said he read in the newspaper the next day that the very same guy, based on the description in the paper, had walked into another gas station about 10 miles down the highway. But unlike my dad, the clerk in that station hadn't been so lucky. The guy was the actual owner and operator of the station, tried to resist the robbery, and ended up paying with his life. From what my dad could tell, the sketchy guy pulled his gun. The station owner went for his, and the sketchy guy just pulled the trigger. Boom, killed him behind his own counter. Now my dad obviously didn't have a gun, but he said he was panicking just watching the guy walking around the store. If that was him getting robbed by someone with such an itchy trigger finger, he might have made a wrong move or something. And bam, I literally wouldn't even be around today to write this. I think the sketchy guy ended up getting the death penalty to that, or died in some shootout with the cops. Maybe even the same cops who attended my dad's call. I can't quite remember which, but Dad always mentioned him getting what he deserved whenever he tells the story. Now, I don't have to tell you how glad I am of that too, because even though it's so surreal to me, the idea of someone actually hurting my dad is just on a whole other kind of rage that I would feel. That story doesn't just give me a belief in guardian angels, even if they do appear in unconventional forms. But it also makes me believe that there might just be something like divine justice too. I'm not a long-haul trucker. And I don't drive an 18-wheeler, but I do drive a flatbed truck that makes deliveries around my home state of Maine. And more importantly, I definitely have a creepy story to share with you guys. This one night back in the winter of 2008. I was driving down this dark stretch of road in the late evening, and with it being winter, it was dark out. I'm driving between towns too, and some stretches of road out here barely have lights on them. I can only see what my headlights are lighting up. So imagine how scared I was when suddenly they pick up a guy just standing right in the middle of the road. I had to swerve to miss him. I swear I only just missed the guy. Put it this way. I passed so close to him that I could tell the guy's eyes were closed as I passed him. Yeah, that close. And that wasn't the only detail I noticed about the guy. Not only was he dressed entirely in white, but he looked like he had some kind of white makeup all over his face, and head to the guy was bald, and he had the same bright white skin tone all over. The second I came to a stop, I jumped out of my truck and ran back to see if he was okay. I mean, I was still worried I might have clipped him on the way past or something, because like I said, I must have been just inches from smashing this guy. But as I ran back just a few feet, I noticed the road was completely empty. I've had people say to me, "Oh, it's definitely a ghost." And let me tell you, it wasn't a friggin' ghost. Not that I don't believe in all that stuff. More like I heard the guy running off through a field at the side of the road. I didn't see him run, but I could 100% hear him running. I don't know what in God's name. He was thinking it will have some weird attempt to taking his own life for what, but Jesus Christ, am I glad I didn't hit him. Because I think that would have messed me up for the rest of my life. Way back when I was like 8 or 9 years old, I remember talking to my dad about religion and God and stuff. At one point in the conversation, I have this really vivid memory of a question I asked, and the answer he gave me. The question was something like, "Do angels really exist?" And his answer was something along the lines of this: before it was born. Before Mom and him were even an item. My dad used to drive trucks for a living. And this is way back before labor laws are strict about brakes or mild limits. So Dad would sometimes take jobs that would require him to drive for maybe 24 or maybe 36 hours straight. So this one particular night, after having already driven for a really long time, he noticed his eyelids getting heavier and heavier as he got sleepier and sleepier. Even worse, any attempt to wake himself up just didn't seem to be working. He chugged down the rest of his coffee, tried blasting himself with cold air from the AC, but nothing did the trick. He says he remembers passing mile marker 146, and since he had this strange stretch of road in front of him, he decided to rest his eyes and take a deep breath for maybe only 2 seconds, tops. Then the next thing he knows, he feels his head do the nod-jerk thing, which woke him up with a gasp. He opened his eyes to see that he was driving straight toward mile marker 158, which was right up against some ravine-type thing. If he had woken up a second later, his whole truck would have plummeted down the ravine. And he'd have surely been killed. But because he came to at that exact moment, he was able to safely course correct. He says if the difference between life and death came down to literally just a second, I actually wouldn't even exist right now. Once he stopped, he just pulled into the side of the road first chance he could and did the math on the whole thing. He said he must have slept through miles of driving down perfectly straight highway, doing anything between 50 only to wake up right at the moment he needed to in order to save his own skin. It was a really long-winded way of saying that he didn't actually know if angels really existed. But he sure believed they did. Either that, or there was some kind of force in the universe that woke him up just as he reached mile marker 158 right at the exact split second that he needed to, because as I already said, if he'd nodded off a millisecond later, or nodded himself awake a millisecond later, I wouldn't be writing this right now. I just want to start off by saying what a huge fan of your channel I am. I drive trucks for a living and most of my journeys are long haul, which means I have plenty of time to just sit in my cab doing a whole lot of nothing. As you can probably guess, it gets really, really boring. And if it wasn't for all the videos you put out, I think I'd have gotten straight up crazy by now. I don't really have a lot of free time whenever I'm home. So it's taken me way longer to write this than maybe it should. But I've been meaning to share something that happened to me with you for the longest time now. And I think it'd be awesome to hear one of my own experiences on one of your videos. So a few years ago, I was cruising west about 70 on the I-76, just outside of Denver, Colorado. It had been a pretty boring haul up until that point. I mean, Colorado was pretty and all, but the whole drive had been completely uneventful. The weather had been great. There had been nothing to slow me down, and I was starting to think the whole ride would carry on without a hitch. But then out of nowhere, I see this huge, almost solid cloud of dirt coming over the horizon. It had to be at least 20 to 30 feet wide, completely covering the road ahead. And it was at least as tall as my truck's cab. So maybe 12 to 15 feet tall. At first, I had no idea what I was looking at could have been a vehicle fire or something. But then I couldn't see the smoke billowing from anywhere, and I couldn't see any car or truck either. Then I figured it might have been like a dust storm or something. But a dust storm that's only 30 feet wide. It couldn't be. I didn't have any way of dodging it. So I just slowed down, hit the washers and just pray that there wasn't any rocks getting whipped up that might smash my windshield. I'm an owner and operator too. So any damage and it's my insurance, not some companies. Seconds later, wham! I hit it. And the noise in my cab was seriously loud. That's what set it apart from a regular dust storm. They just don't make that kind of noise. Then the second thing that set it apart from a dust storm was the mess it left on my windshield. Because as I hit the mass of it, whatever it was, everything that hit my windshield left a smear of what looked like some kind of juice on the glass. That's when I worked out what I was driving into. It was bees, all these freaking huge bees that seriously sounded like rocks when they were slamming into my cab. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. I mean, I'd seen giant swarms of locusts on TV before, but bees, I didn't think they even swarm like that. Two things really creeped me out about the whole thing, and not so much all the bee guts on my windshield either. Because I'm not a particularly squeamish person. The first thing was how the fight had just been walking at the side of the road. Those things might have actually killed me. A couple of 100 bee stings could easily kill a person. So I read anyway. And if they're aggressive when they're in that swarming state, that had been the end of May. But then the second thing, and the thing that stuck with me long after I passed through the swarm, was the idea that they'd been flying like that to avoid some epic natural disaster or something. For the next few miles, I found myself getting really anxious, half expecting to feel an earthquake or see a meteor falling from the sky or something. Obviously, nothing like that happened. Thank God. But the first chance I could, I looked up giant bee swarms on Google to see if they were actually a thing. Obviously they are, but ones that size are an extremely rare event. When I told another trucker about the whole thing recently, he told me I was lucky to see something like that. Like it was some kind of natural wonder or something. But let me tell you, I didn't feel so lucky to be driving through it at the time. Was driving my 18-wheeler on this long-haul stretch one time when I suddenly needed to pee real bad. I figured I'd just wait for a gas station or something. But after maybe 5 or 10 minutes of driving, there was no sign of any, and no science to tell me if I was close to one or not. So to save from soaking my drawers, I decided to pull over and take a leak at the side of the road. It was incredibly dark outside, and although the side of the road I stopped on had a bunch of woods, and I'll admit it was way too spooky for me to just wander off into the dark. And being as dark as it was, I figured I'd be able to just put my hazard lights on and take a few steps to the side before whipping it out. Then right as I'm peeing, I hear something running through the trees toward me. I mean, whatever it was pounding dirt as it came at me. I couldn't see a freaking thing. And it scared the life out of me even more. So I tried to stop peeing and put my junk away, then just bolted back to my truck cab as quickly as I could. I have expected whatever it was to slam itself up against the door of my truck. And since I keep a gun in my glove box, first thing I did was grab it and then aim it right towards the window, getting ready to blast the first thing I saw. It felt like I was lying there on the seat for like half an hour, but in reality, it was maybe only a minute or two. And absolutely nothing appeared at the window or banged up against the door of my truck. I know it was dumb on me. But I spent the next few minutes looking out of the driver's side window checking for whatever it was I heard running. But again, I didn't see anything. It was about the same time and realized that I hadn't actually stopped peeing when I thought I did, and in the process of putting it away and diving into my truck, I soaked the entirety of my pants and seat. I spent the next few miles driving back buck naked from the waist down with my pants slung over the air conditioner, trying to dry them before the next rest up. Definitely one of my worst nights ever on the job. And for more than one reason too. So this might not be the most terrifying story y'all have ever heard. But I'm pretty sure you understand why I found this so creepy. I drove trucks for a living, and this one morning, I'm cruising down this stretch of highway during the summer. And he was early enough for the sun to be up and incredibly bright. And when it comes to around this one bend in the road, all I see in front of me on the blacktop was blood, guts, crushed bones, and it was a massacre out there. It must have been like 100 small animals bleeding all over the road for maybe a quarter mile. And I had never seen anything like that. My life looked like the set of a horror movie or something. Later, I found out that some science place had been raided by animal rights protesters or something, who let out all these minks or ferrets or whatever in the middle of the night. The four things booked through a forest across the field and the known to a busy stretch of highway. Boom, boom, boom. They're running back and forth, getting crushed by cars. Must have been a few of them coming thick and fast, because I can't see how they got so many at one time before all of them things just scattered and got their butts off the road. But good God, I suppose the road to hell really is paved with good intentions. From 1975 to 1990, the American Southlands were stalked by one of the most abhorrent and vicious killers the country has ever known. He is thought to have tortured, violated, and murdered more than 50 different women and girls during his grotesque 15-year spree. And while many other killers would have been apprehended long before they reached such body count, the secret to this killer's success was his mobility. You see, not only was he constantly on the move using his 16-wheeler truck, but he also converted his soundproof sleeper cab into a veritable torture chamber. This is the story of Robert Ben Rhodes, perhaps better known as the Truck Stop Killer. Born on November 22nd of 1945 in Council Bluffs, Iowa, Rhodes' his formative years set him apart from most serial killers due to their relative normalcy. Although his father was serving soldier in West Germany until his elementary school years, Rhodes' childhood seems to be objectively stable and wholesome. He was never abused. He never acted out. And by his teenage years, whatever trouble he got into is generally characteristic of a regular angsty teen. He was active and outgoing during his high school years, taking part in sports such as football and wrestling. He regularly attended the Thomas Jefferson High School French Club and was apparently a rather proficient francophone. The aforementioned trouble involves juvenile arrests for public fighting and vehicle tampering. But I'm sure we can all agree that very few young men make it through their teenage years without getting into the occasional scuffle. It seems that darkness only entered his life in 1964. The same year he enlisted in the U.S. Marines. It was around this time that his father was suddenly arrested by Council Bluffs police, and the local community was stunned when they learned it was on charges of inappropriately touching a 12-year-old girl. Then, just when it seemed that the situation couldn't get any worse, Rhodes, his father, took his own life before he could be tried. Following his father doing so, Rhodes entered something of a downward spiral, and as military conduct worsened to the point where in 1968, he was dishonorably discharged from the military for his involvement in a violent robbery. During the years that followed, Rhodes's existence was marred by his inability to settle into any kind of routine lifestyle. He briefly attended college, but quickly dropped out. He then applied to join the Council Bluffs police force, but had his application rejected due to his dishonorable discharge from the military. He subsequently found work in a variety of stores, supermarkets, warehouses, and restaurants, marrying and divorcing 3 different women in the process. One of these women, Deborah, recalls that Rhodes became horribly abusive once the flame of their romance burned out, and she found herself constantly rebuffing his attempts to introduce sadistic masochistic activities to the relationship. Eventually, Rhodes found a form of employment that he could finally settle on, one that will take him far away from Iowa, all the pain, torment, and shame, and of his father's despicable inclinations, long-haul trucking. Rhodes later stated that he had been preying on hitchhikers and truck stop escorts since the mid-1970s. But due to his mobility, he didn't come to the attention of authorities until 1990. It was in January of that year that Rhodes happened across a husband and wife hitchhiker couple named Patricia Walsh and Douglas Akowski. Patricia and Douglas had been hitchhiking across the state of Texas and, by all accounts, had experienced a pleasant journey thus far. They had no reason to be suspicious of Rhodes, who seemed perfectly affable when he first stopped to pick them up. Yet shortly after they continued along the highway, the couple's nightmare began in earnest. It's not clear how Douglas was murdered, but when his body was found in Texas's Sutton County, it would not be possibly identified until 2 years later. In the week that followed her husband's murder, Patricia Walsh was kept alive for 7 long days before she was finally killed. In that time, police suspect she was essentially used as a pleasure slave, kept bound and gagged in Rhodes' soundproof sleeper cab, and repeatedly tortured until he grew bored of her. Her body was then dumped in Millard County, Utah, and by the time her body found its way onto a coroner's table, she was barely recognizable. A month later, Rhodes snatched 18-year-old Shauna Holtz from the side of the highway, bundling her into his makeshift torture chamber, where she was tortured and kept prisoner for around 2 weeks. Miraculously, Shauna managed to escape captivity and immediately rushed to inform law enforcement of her harrowing ordeal. She gave the police a detailed description of both Rhodes and the truck he was driving, and this led to the speedy detention of her attacker. However, when faced with actually pressing charges against Rhodes, Shauna suddenly began to have second thoughts. She told investigating police officers that she didn't think a jury would believe her story. And even when assured that the mountain of evidence would ensure a conviction, she refused to appear in court. "I don't see any good in filing charges," she said on record. "It's just going to be my word against his. If there was any evidence I would file charges and sue him." Shannon was once again shown the massive amounts of collated evidence and was told not a jury in the land would decline to convict Rhodes of his heinous and brutal actions. But still, she declined a court appearance. It's now believed that Shauna found the combination of fear and trauma to be completely and utterly psychologically overwhelming. She may have believed that if cleared of the charges, the Rhodes would hunt her down to subject her to more of the same awful treatment. And if he did, she might not be fortunate enough to escape for a second time. 2 weeks after the kidnapping charges against Rhodes were dropped, 2 teenage runaways named Ricky Lee Jones and Regina K. Walters were attempting to hitchhike out of the Houston suburb of Pasadena. Rhodes spotted them, put on his facade of friendliness, and as the young couple climbed into the cab of his truck, their fate was sealed. Just like with Patricia Walsh and Douglas Akowski, Ricky Lee Jones was murdered almost straight away, with his body being found on March 3 of 1991 in Lamar County, Mississippi, whereas Walters was told she'd suffered the same fate unless she complied. The kidnapping of Regina Kay is perhaps the most viscerally disturbing of Rose's murders, because in this case, there exists actual photographical evidence of his victim's final moments. The police would later seize photographs from Rhodes's home that depicted Regina Walters and other victims being forced to stand and sit in painful stress positions. These photographs are extremely disturbing as the horror etched into their faces is palpable. In Virginia's case, the images show her having differing hair lengths, with a variety of different bruises, suggesting that she had been held captive for a very long time, possibly even months. In addition to physical abuse and psychological torture, Regina was subjected to Robert Ben Rhodes chose to cruelly taunt Gina's father in a series of anonymous phone calls. In the months after he kidnapped her, Rhodes to call his home or office and say things like, "I made some changes. I cut her hair." During one phone call through, Gina's father asked Rhodes to at least tell him if his daughter was alive or not. Rhodes reportedly responded with, "Allah, she's alive all right. I've left her hung up in a barn somewhere, but you'll never find her." There was a lie. By the time the phone call was made, Regina was dead, killed in the manner which is almost too sickening to recount. On the day of her execution, Regina was taken to a derelict piece of farmland where there exists a rotting, dilapidated shack. Rhodes had cut her long flowing curls short, forced her into a long black dress and heels, then told her to pose as if he was about to attack her. The photos Ben Rhodes took of her that day are easy to find online, and it's possible that she was assured that she would be safe if she only complied with the request. It was a lie. Once Rhodes had finished taking photographs of Regina and her meek and awkward poses, wrapped a piece of metal wire around her neck, Ben strangled the life out of her. Thankfully, Rhodes would be apprehended a short while later, denying him the chance to kill again. But it was undeniably a frighteningly close call for his latest prospective victim. On the early morning of April 1, 1990, Arizona Highway Patrol Trooper Mike Miller discovered a truck with its hazard lights on at the side of the interstate. Deciding to stop to see if the driver needed any assistance, Miller parked his patrol car at the edge of the road, then got out to investigate. When he drew level with the truck's sleeper cab, he heard a faint sound coming from inside. Then when he opened the small hatch, he was greeted by an ear-splitting scream. Inside was a naked and bloodied Kathleen Vine, whose arms were restrained by a pair of handcuffs which had been grafted to the ceiling of the sleeper cab. When Rhodes emerged from the driver's seat of the truck, he told the horrified Trooper Miller that he had simply found Kathleen at the side of the highway like that, and was in the process of seeking help for her. Thankfully, Miller didn't buy Rhodes' ruse, and the officer drew his gun on him, disarming and arresting him in the process. It was only when Rhodes was in police custody that a homicide detective was able to connect him to a string of disappearances across America's southern states. And not long after, a charge of murder was added to an already extensive list of offenses, including aggravated assault and unlawful imprisonment. It wasn't until 1994 that Rhodes was convicted of the murder of Virginia Kay Walters. And as punishment, he was sentenced to life without parole at Menard Correctional Center in Chester, Illinois. Just over a decade later, he was extradited to Utah to be tried for the deaths of Candace Walsh and Douglas Akowski. The charges were dropped after the families of the victims claimed that testifying in court would be far too painful to bear. They were reassured that Rhodes is about to be extradited to Texas to be tried for the murder of Ricky Lee Jones, and in this case, Rhodes pleaded guilty to his death in exchange for a second life sentence, ensuring he would never again see the light of day. Rhodes is now 76 years old. Ben is still detained at the Menard Maximum Security Prison. But although he has previously claimed as many as 50 victims, authorities have said it's unlikely he'll ever stand trial again. That means it's impossible to know just how many missing people Rhodes is responsible for, and that there are scores of family across Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Utah who will never truly know what happened to their loved ones. It's also not entirely clear why Rhodes chose to kill in the first place. Perhaps it all stems from the anger and shame he felt regarding his father's deviance and eventually him taking his own life. That killing the innocent was his way of getting back at the world that he felt had wronged him while he was still in the prime of his life. The only thing we know for certain is that Rhodes was imbued with a rare distilled variety of evil that led him not only to torture those who would go on to kill, but also to reach out and torture their families as well.